The first man to walk in space has died in Moscow at the age of 85. Alexei Leonov carried out his spacewalk on March 18, 1965, 10 weeks before the US was able to replicate the feat. To discuss this and the latest from the space world, I'm now joined by astrophysicist and cosmologist at ANU, Brad Tucker. Brad, great to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, no worries.
It's interesting. Most people would think that it was actually the US that did this first, but it was indeed Alexei.
That's right. You know, people forget in the early times of space program in the early 60s, the USSR was beating the US in a lot of different goals. And with Alexei Leonov, he was one of the first spacewalks. And it was actually a really dangerous thing. So beyond being the first person in orbit, Yuri Gagarin, no one really knew what happened once you went outside that capsule. And in fact, during this 12-minute, just over 12-minute spacewalk, in this very grainy footage, you know, he says, "Oh, hey, the Earth is round," and he saw stars all around. But what actually happened was his spacesuit started to puff out. He couldn't fit back in, so he had to release pressure and essentially leak his spacesuit to get inside, knowing well if he did too much of this, the pressure would change inside, and you could actually cause your blood to boil. So he faced a lot of danger doing this, so really was a pioneer of the space program.
Wow, that's amazing. And you mentioned a space race. Take us through this mission by Russia.
Yeah, you know, Russia was doing very early goals. So they had Yuri Gagarin. They started to do all of the testing of just human interaction really in space. They started to plan what we call lunar missions shortly after it. What was realized, though, between the US and Russia was the US was falling behind a lot of these things. So the US kind of said, let's just skip 10 steps and work on the technology needed to get to the moon, which was kind of the ultimate game there. That gamble paid and worked well because they did beat the Russians to the moon. And in fact, then the Russians suffered delays and actually never made it to the moon. But Alexei Leonov, his career didn't end there. He actually governed the Soyuz 15 mission, which was the first joint Apollo-Soyuz joining. It was really the beginning of space cooperation. This led to Shuttle and Mir program combined missions and ultimately to the International Space Station. So in a lot of different ways, he was leading space for 50 years almost.
And fascinating. Well, certainly a really, really good innings and good on him. Let's move on now to another topic, Brad. The supermassive black hole in the centre of our Milky Way actually released a huge flare 3.5 million years ago. What was this flare? Take us through it.
So we know that black holes are active. We see black holes active in really far away galaxies. We see some of these galaxies with quieter black holes. And right now, our black hole is fairly quiet. There's not a lot of stuff coming out. But it appears about 3 million years ago, our black hole released a huge amount of energy, so a huge amount of light and radiation. And it actually lasted for about 300,000 years. So it wasn't a very quick process. And this is actually a pretty big implication for our galaxy. If it releases lots of radiation, this radiation could hit, say, planets and actually cause damage to those planets. And 3 million years ago, the pre-human civilizations, not civilizations, but ancestors, were on this Earth. So they would have had an impact from this super flare that emitted from our galaxy.
And how will this discovery allow researchers to gather more evidence, I guess, about this explosion?
Yeah, so we like to use our galaxy to compare other galaxies, just as our sun is a fairly good studied star, and we can compare it to other stars. So knowing how active and the power of the black hole in the center of our galaxy allows us to tell us how other black holes, like we're seeing here as an animation, tell us their power. And therefore, when black holes emit light, it actually mixes the galaxy. So it causes gas and stars to swirl around, and this actually creates new stars. So by figuring out when these periods have happened, it tells us the birth rate, how often, and how many stars can be born in a galaxy, which is kind of cool because ultimately other things have ended in a black hole to cause them to be born in new stars. So a giant recycling system.
Brad, 20 previously unknown moons around Saturn have now been discovered, and apparently we can even name them. But take us through this.
Yeah, so it's now the king of planets. It's taken back the title from Jupiter. So Saturn's total of moons now is 82. Most of the moons are really tiny. So the biggest moon of Saturn is called Titan. It's about the same size as our moon. These newly discovered ones are much, much smaller than this. They range all the way down to 5 kilometers, so not really big at all. They are really far away from the moon. So in comparison to what we're seeing here as Titan, these are really tiny things really far out from Saturn. So it's not like they're in the ring system of Saturn, but they're very different from, say, Enceladus, which you're seeing now. They're pretty much just frozen rocks. But it really tells us how much stuff can orbit around Saturn. And just like Jupiter, it actually has 2 streams of moons. Ones that move in the same direction of the planet and one that actually spin backwards. So there's something that's gone on with some of these really distant moons and how they've been formed, similar to what we found on Jupiter 18 months ago when the 12 new moons were discovered of Jupiter.
Another fascinating discovery. And just finally, Brad, let's discuss this year's 2009 Nobel Peace Prize. The winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, it was actually a tie, but 2 of the men won for the discovery of an exoplanet orbiting a solar-type star. Now, firstly, what exactly is this, and what did they discover?
So they were really the first person to discover a planet around another star. So the very first planet around another star happened in 1992, but it occurred around by accident around a pulsar, essentially a dead star. Now, these 2, so it was the supervisor and his student, set out to do a project to actually see, can we find planets around other stars? You know, we've talked a lot about all these new planets we find. It's only been a generation that we've actually known that there's planets orbiting around another star. And this has been a very fundamental discovery of our place in the universe, how common these things are, and therefore the common potential for life out there. So it's nice that this was awarded essentially the ultimate prize in our field.
Well, good on them. Certainly an incredible discovery. Brad Tucker, pleasure to speak with you as always. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks.